Inside the Texas state capitol, beneath blinding lights and the piercing gaze of a nation, Jasmine Crockett confronts Governor Greg Abbott in a high-stakes battle over SB 8, the brutal law that strips away nearly all abortion rights in Texas. Abbott leans on polished lies and hollow victories, boasting about protecting life. But within minutes, Crockett detonates the hearing with damning, state-sealed evidence that proves he knew the devastating consequences all along. The chamber freezes. Abbott stares blankly, exposed. Power slips from his grasp. If Abbott chose power over lives, how many others already have? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under a gold-tinged Texas sky, the state capitol loomed like a fortress. Protesters lined the gates, some crying for justice, others defending the unborn, while police held the line, silent and grim. Inside, the hearing room buzzed with tension, every seat filled, every eye waiting. Then the doors burst open. Greg Abbott entered like a conquering general, his stride slow, deliberate, rehearsed. Cameras flashed. His smirk said it all. This was his domain. He didn't come to answer. He came to win. For years, Greg Abbott had ruled this building like a general in peacetime. Confident, unquestioned, untouchable. Senate Bill 8 had been his most brutal weapon, a near-total abortion ban that deputized citizens to turn on one another, turning Texas into a legal battlefield where pregnant women became targets and doctors feared their own decisions. It was cruel by design, and Abbott had survived every attempt to strike it down, every protest, every legal challenge. To his supporters, he was a hero of the righteous cause. To his critics, he was a calculated architect of suffering. But Abbott didn't care. He believed the law, his law, was too deeply rooted to be challenged, and that any attack would fall before it reached him. That belief wasn't arrogance. It was armor. As he took his seat at the front of the committee chamber, reporters scribbled notes and whispered predictions. Abbott leaned into the microphone and adjusted his tie. In his mind, this wasn't a hearing. It was a coronation. And no one, not even the sharp-tongued congresswoman from Dallas, could break the myth of his invincibility. Not yet. But just as the governor settled into his throne of certainty, the room shifted. Subtly at first, like the hush before a storm. She entered without an entourage, without spectacle, yet the air bent around her like a blade-slicing tension. Jasmine Crockett, congresswoman from Dallas, moved through the aisle with calm defiance, dressed in a deep navy suit that caught the light like armor. In her hands was no briefcase, no prepared script, but a thick, battered folder packed with truth. She didn't scan the crowd. She didn't flinch at the stares. She knew the weight of what she carried. The crowd divided as if on cue. Conservatives in the front, whispering with smug confidence. Women's rights advocates clustered in the back, silent but burning with hope. Cameras turned, curious, sensing something had just changed. What was this young woman, barely a few years into Congress, doing on the home turf of one of the most entrenched governors in America? Political insiders scoffed, but Crockett didn't come for their approval. She came for the reckoning. She hadn't even taken her seat, and already Greg Abbott could sense something was different. The silence in the room had changed, not empty, but charged, heavy like the seconds before a lightning strike. Still, he clung to his armor, routine, rhetoric, rehearsed control. With one hand on the table and the other adjusting his mic, the governor of Texas looked out over the crowded hearing room, his expression carved in granite. He didn't blink. He didn't waver. He had faced protests, lawsuits, even national outrage, and survived them all. This wasn't a debate to him. It was a ritual, a stage, and he was the high priest of the story he'd sold to millions. Texas leads the nation in protecting innocent life, he began, his voice slow and deliberate, calculated to sound both humble and heroic. The words weren't meant to persuade. They were meant to sanctify. We've created a culture that supports mothers and families and defends the most vulnerable among us, the unborn. Murmurs of approval rippled through the conservative seats in the front rows. To them, this wasn't just a statement. It was a victory lap. Abbott was calm, confident. His tone didn't rise or tremble. He didn't need to shout. When you believe the room already belongs to you, whispers are enough. He spoke next of statistics. Numbers flowed from his mouth like water over polished stone. Since the passage of Senate Bill 8, he continued, Texas has seen a measurable increase in adoptions. Faith-based pregnancy centers have expanded to meet the needs of women in crisis. Maternal assistance funding is up. Rural outreach programs are delivering prenatal care where none existed before. He paused for effect, letting the numbers settle like a soft veil over the harder realities he left unsaid. We believe every child deserves a chance, and we've built the infrastructure to make that belief real. But for all the confidence in his delivery, there was a hollowness in the space between each line, a silence where truth used to live. Abbott never mentioned the emergency rooms that turned away women in agony, unsure if helping them would violate the law. He never named the doctors who consulted lawyers while patients bled. He didn't say the words rape or incest or non-viable fetus. Not once did he acknowledge the fear that had crept into hospital corridors, into bedrooms, into the aching hearts of women forced to choose between their lives and their liberty. Instead, he leaned harder into the illusion. We've empowered communities, he said, voice swelling with false benevolence. We've created options. We've given voice to those who never had one. But whose voice was he really hearing? Not Maria's, the woman forced to carry a dying fetus to term. Not Sarah's, the teenager raped by her stepfather, denied an abortion in her own state. Not Jennifer's, the woman who nearly died during a miscarriage because care was delayed by fear, bureaucracy, and the chilling effect of Abbott's own law. None of them were in his speech. None of them were in his statistics. Yet he continued, as if the force of repetition alone could make his words true. We've made Texas a leader, he said, a beacon for those who believe in life. Behind him, aides nodded approvingly. Cameras flashed. The front row supporters beamed like parishioners listening to gospel. But deeper in the chamber, a different energy brewed. Faces tightened, hands clenched. Not everyone was buying what he was selling. Not this time. Because this wasn't the Greg Abbott of campaign ads and press conferences. This was a man standing on a shrinking island of half-truths and political insulation, staring across the table at the storm he never saw coming. Still, he pressed on. He spoke of values, of Texan strength, of God-given rights. His voice rose slightly now, not from emotion, but from calculation. He knew the cadence. He knew the rhythm. He was trained to sound like a savior. He was taught that if you speak long enough, clearly enough, confidently enough, people will stop looking at the details. They'll start believing the story, and for years they had. But not today. Not with Jasmine Crockett in the room. She hadn't spoken yet. She hadn't lifted a finger. But she sat like a loaded chamber, silent, steady, precise. And while Abbott wrapped himself in scripted morality, she was counting his lies, one by one. He ended his remarks with a flourish. Texas is proud, he declared, to be the standard bearer of life, and I stand by every decision we've made to protect it. There it was, the finale. The applause came, polite, expected, premeditated, but it couldn't drown out the growing weight pressing down on the chamber. Abbott had just delivered a speech to a nation on fire, using a bucket of empty words, and across from him sat the woman holding the match. The applause had barely settled when Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, not aggressively, not theatrically, but with the quiet control of someone who had been waiting for this exact moment. Her fingertips rested lightly on the folder before her, as if feeling for a pulse beneath its cover. She didn't look at the cameras. She looked straight at Greg Abbott. Governor, she said, her voice calm, deliberate, almost gentle, like a surgeon before the first incision. You spoke at length about supporting mothers. I'd like to ask for specifics. The room, which just moments ago had been filled with the confident cadence of Abbott's speech, shifted its energy. Something had changed. Her tone wasn't confrontational. It was worse. It was confident. Abbott straightened slightly in his chair, instinctively reaching for the familiar armor of vague policy language. Texas has seen encouraging progress, he replied smoothly, the words flowing in that same careful rhythm he'd used 100 times on television. We've expanded maternal outreach, bolstered community care programs, and seen improvements in long-term outcomes. These things take time, of course, but the direction is overwhelmingly positive. It was the kind of answer that had carried him through dozens of press briefings and hostile interviews. A well-constructed wall of euphemism, positive language, generalized outcomes, undefined terms. He spoke of net improvements and growing infrastructure, of new initiatives showing promise. But he never said who had died along the way. He never said who had been forgotten. His words hovered in the air, sterile and calculated, meant to obscure, not clarify. And for a moment, it might have worked, until she moved. Without breaking eye contact, Crockett opened her folder, slowly, precisely, not for show, but like someone revealing a weapon too dangerous to draw hastily. Her fingers slid beneath a thick, stapled report, and she held it up for the room to see. The Texas Department of State Health Services letterhead gleamed under the hearing room lights. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. According to this report, your report, the maternal mortality rate in Texas has increased by 34% since SB 8 went into effect. It hit the room like a slap in a cathedral. A rustle swept through the gallery. Not noise, movement, subtle, restrained, but unmistakably visceral. Even the conservative front row shifted, the way people do when they hear something they didn't expect or couldn't deny. Abbott's face tightened, just a flicker, a micro-expression, but in this setting, every twitch was a headline. His lips parted slightly, but no answer came, and Crockett wasn't finished. She placed the report flat on the desk in front of her, her palm resting on it as if to steady the truth beneath her hand. You said we're improving outcomes, she continued, voice low but unrelenting. But these are the outcomes. These are the numbers. 34%. That's not a theory. That's not a projection. That is the cost, measured in mothers. She let the words sit there, not rushing the silence, not backing away from the weight of what had just been said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to perform, because reality doesn't need applause. It only needs to be seen. And now, finally, it was. The air hadn't recovered from the last blow when Jasmine Crockett turned to the next page, her hands steady, her gaze sharper than ever. The chamber remained still, but it was a volatile stillness, like dry grass before a spark. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Every syllable landed with the weight of a verdict. Governor, she said, quieter now, but more dangerous for it, are you aware that Black women in Texas are 3 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related complications than white women? Her words didn't echo. They detonated, not in volume, but in truth. The kind of truth that doesn't move through the air. It moves through the chest, leaving something broken behind. Abbott looked frozen in real time, lips parted as if caught between denial and calculation. He didn't speak. Couldn't speak. Because in that moment, there was no statistic that could protect him. No slogan polished enough to erase that disparity. Crockett didn't wait for his answer. She already knew he knew. This isn't coming from an advocacy group or partisan spin, she continued, lifting the report so the committee, the cameras, the country could see. It's from your own Department of State Health Services, page 19, section 4. Since SB 8 took effect, emergency room visits related to pregnancy complications have spiked by 67%. She paused, not to dramatize, to let it settle, because sometimes silence is the most honest part of the conversation. The room was silent, but the silence wasn't still. It trembled. Reporters' pens hovered in midair. Staffers shifted in their seats, unsure whether to take notes or just brace for what came next. Crockett stared directly at Abbott. No venom, no mockery, just the brutal clarity of someone who had carried this truth too long to cushion it now. This is what your law has done, she said. This is what happens when fear replaces medicine, when ideology tramples data, when protecting embryos becomes more urgent than protecting the women carrying them. Still no answer from Abbott. She leaned forward slightly, but it felt seismic. These are not abstract numbers, Governor. These are women bleeding out in emergency rooms while physicians hesitate, not because they don't know how to save them, but because they don't know if saving them will cost them their license or their freedom. Her tone was iron now, but still restrained, as if fury was a tool, and she knew exactly how to use it without wasting a stroke. This isn't protection. This isn't life. This is legally sanctioned neglect. And for black women, it's a death sentence signed by your pen. The silence that followed Crockett's indictment was thick enough to crack. It hung over the chamber like humidity before a thunderstorm, dense, inescapable, and waiting to explode. Greg Abbott, who just moments ago had delivered his speech with mechanical confidence, now looked visibly unsettled. His eyes darted briefly across the room, perhaps to aides, perhaps to exits, but quickly returned to the microphone. He adjusted it unnecessarily, a delay tactic dressed in decorum. Then he spoke. "Congresswoman," he began, his tone restrained but threaded with condescension, "I believe it's important that we acknowledge the broader context here. Maternal health outcomes are shaped by an intricate web of factors: behavioral, social, economic. It would be misleading to attribute these outcomes to a single piece of legislation." He leaned slightly forward as if to reassert authority, but the words felt fragile, scripted lines recited out of habit rather than conviction. He spoke of nuance. He spoke of complexity, but his voice was defensive now, not decisive. For years, those phrases, multivariable data, systemic contributors, long-term societal trends, had given him shelter, a way to deflect without denying. But this time, the shelter crumbled. Crockett didn't blink. Her face remained still, but her voice, when it came, was a seismic shift in the room's energy. "I'm not finished, Governor." The words weren't loud, but they cracked like thunder through the marble chamber. She didn't raise her tone. She didn't need to. The authority in her voice was unshakable, unflinching. A woman who had stood in courtrooms with men far more dangerous than Greg Abbott and hadn't flinched there either. Her gaze locked with his, and for the first time, the governor looked like a man unsure if he was still in control. "This isn't about theory," she continued, not giving him a second to respond. "Not about models, not about policy abstractions cooked up in air-conditioned boardrooms." Her hand tapped the report again, once firmly. "These numbers don't need context. They need accountability. They're not academic. They're fatal." Every word landed like a gavel strike. The phrase, "I'm not finished," wasn't just a sentence. It was a reckoning. A woman asserting that after generations of being spoken over, stepped on, and sacrificed for political ambition, the time for polite deferral was over. Abbott sat back, lips parted but voiceless. The governor of Texas, who had steamrolled legislatures, silenced protesters, and passed one of the most extreme abortion laws in the country, had just been stopped cold by a sentence that wasn't even shouted. And Jasmine Crockett hadn't even raised her voice. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. And she certainly didn't give Greg Abbott time to spin. Because some truths don't need interpretation. They only need exposure. And Jasmine Crockett was done waiting for permission. Her hand moved with a calmness that made the moment more terrifying. With surgical precision, she reached into her folder and withdrew a thick manila envelope. The kind usually passed behind closed doors, never meant for sunlight. Stamped across the top in block red letters was a single word that changed the temperature of the room. Confidential. The hum of reporters' recorders paused. Even the faint rustle of suits shifting in their chairs seemed to vanish. Crockett didn't look at the cameras. She didn't need to. Every eye was already fixed on her as she placed the envelope on the desk like a final piece of evidence in a trial that had only one verdict left. She drew out the first document and laid it open before her like a map leading to a crime scene. "Governor," she said, the edge in her voice now unmistakable, not theatrical, but judicial, the kind of tone you hear right before a gavel slams down. "This email is from your chief of staff, dated August 15, 2021, just weeks before you signed SB 8 into law." Abbott stiffened. His hand, once calmly folded, now gripped the armrest of his chair with a whiteness spreading into his knuckles. Crockett continued, her voice unrelenting. "The governor is concerned about the optics of the maternal mortality increase we're projecting," she read. "Legal suggests we avoid any public statements linking the abortion restrictions to healthcare outcomes until after the midterms." A wave of silence thundered through the chamber. No gasp this time. just the sound of truth suffocating the oxygen out of the room. The audience wasn't confused. They understood exactly what those words meant. Abbott hadn't merely failed to anticipate the human cost of his law. He had known and chosen secrecy. He had received a forecast of suffering and decided to gamble it against political timing. Crockett leaned forward, slowly, almost sympathetically, but not quite. "Let me be clear," she said, her tone cooling into something harder than rage. "You weren't unaware. You weren't misinformed. You were warned, explicitly, by your own team that maternal deaths would rise. And instead of sounding the alarm, you silenced it." She held the document aloft now, so the cameras could catch the text, the headers, the date. "This isn't conjecture. This isn't spin. This is from inside your own house. And it proves you were more afraid of losing votes than losing women's lives." The manila folder remained open beside her, a wound still bleeding evidence. Abbott sat frozen, his breath shallow, lips twitching as if to respond. But no words came. Not because he didn't have talking points, but because no talking point could survive what had just been read aloud. And Jasmine Crockett hadn't even opened the next page. The air was already heavy with the weight of what had been revealed. Statistics, reports, damning internal emails. But Jasmine Crockett knew numbers alone couldn't fully expose the impact. Not until the suffering had names. Not until the consequences could no longer hide behind sanitized language and legal distance. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she slowed her cadence, lowered her tone, and picked up a sheet of paper with a photograph attached. An ordinary image, but one that held extraordinary weight. "This," she said, holding it out for the room to see, "is Maria Santos, a mother, a wife, a woman from Houston who wanted nothing more than to protect her family." She paused, her voice solemn. At 20 weeks pregnant, Maria learned that her baby had a rare and fatal condition. The doctors told her, without doubt, the child would not survive after birth. They recommended intervention, not to end a life, but to prevent needless suffering. She let the words hang. "But under your law, Governor," her doctors refused, not because they lacked the skill, not because they lacked compassion, but because they feared punishment. They were afraid of losing everything for doing what medicine demanded. Crockett inhaled sharply but didn't blink. So Maria carried that child to term, went through labor, and then held her baby as it gasped for air, until it died in her arms. That was her only option, because Senate Bill 8 made mercy a legal risk. The silence that followed wasn't stillness, it was suffocation. Faces turned away. One reporter dropped their pen. Crockett didn't stop. She gently set Maria's photo aside and pulled out another, a school portrait this time. The kind parents hang on the fridge, never imagining it will be shown in a congressional hearing. "This is Sarah. She's 16 years old. She lives in East Texas. Last year, she experienced an assault so traumatic I won't describe it in full. But what you need to know is this. She became pregnant. Her mother, distraught, desperate, looked for help. And what did she find? Hospitals that turned her away, clinics that had shuttered, providers who said, 'We can't help you here anymore.'" Crockett's voice tightened, but she never lost control. They drove across 2 states, over 800 miles, relying on donations from strangers online just to afford travel, lodging, and care. That's what your law did. Not to criminals, not to politicians, but to a 16-year-old girl who had already endured the unthinkable. She placed the second photo beside Maria's and reached for one last sheet. No image this time. Just a name. And that was enough. "And finally, we have Jennifer," she said. "She experienced a medical emergency, a miscarriage, the kind that happens every day to women of every background. She began bleeding heavily, was rushed to the hospital, and then left waiting." Crockett's eyes locked onto Abbott's. "Why?" "Because under your law, her doctors needed legal guidance before they could act. Not medical clearance. Legal clearance." The audience had gone utterly still now, every breath suspended. She waited in pain, in fear, not knowing if care would come in time. She nearly died. Not because the doctors didn't know what to do, but because they didn't know if they were allowed to do it. Then, without shifting her tone, Without letting the drama swell artificially, Crockett spoke the words that broke the room. Her name is Jennifer Abbott. A beat, no sound, just the cold stillness of realization. She took a step forward, only slightly, and looked directly at the man whose name echoed hers. Governor, she could be your cousin, your daughter, your wife. Your name is on this law, and her name is on that intake form. She tapped the paper gently once. Think about that. She didn't accuse. She didn't rage. She simply let the truth finish what no political slogan could withstand. And for the first time that morning, Greg Abbott had no defense. The name had landed like a hammer blow. Jennifer Abbott. And it hadn't just shaken the room, it had dismantled the man at the center of it. Greg Abbott stood motionless behind the polished wooden podium, the same one from which he had so often delivered sweeping declarations and confident deflections. But now, under the brutal light of truth and cameras, he was no longer the architect of the moment. He was its prisoner. His eyes were wide but unfocused, staring past the documents, past the chamber, into some unseen corner of disbelief. His lips parted faintly, searching for a response, for language, but none came. His breath slowed, his fingers gripping the edge of the podium just minutes earlier in control, now clutched it with quiet desperation. The knuckles went white, his shoulders sagged ever so slightly, betraying the pressure of a silence he could not escape. The cameras did not cut away. The nation watched. Every second dragged, not with dead air, but with mounting reckoning. The kind of silence that doesn't calm, it convicts. 30 seconds passed, and it wasn't just the length that mattered. It was what it revealed. This was not the silence of reflection. It was the silence of collapse, of a man who had run out of alibis, trapped in the courtroom of public consequence. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice or posture for headlines. She simply stood still, a storm made of stillness. Then she spoke, and the words landed with surgical finality. "You knew," she said, her voice low but perfectly audible in the breathless quiet. "You knew women would die. You were warned. You saw the data, and you signed it anyway." Her pause was deliberate, not for effect, but to let the truth dig deeper. Then, without blinking, she finished. "Because you wanted to win." There was no need for shouting, no need for spectacle. The devastation was complete, not from drama, but from clarity. And Greg Abbott, the man who had built his career on unwavering control, now stood stripped of it, every camera documenting the precise second that control vanished. The silence that followed Crockett's final statement was not the kind that settled. It pulsed, like a shock wave rolling beneath the marble floors of the hearing chamber. Greg Abbott remained motionless, still gripping the podium, still mute, his gaze fixed on nothing. But the rest of the room had begun to move. What had been a stiff, politically charged chamber just minutes ago was now on the verge of rupture. It began with a single woman, mid-aisle, clutching her bag to her chest, rising to her feet, her eyes glassy with emotion. She didn't shout. She didn't cheer. She just began to clap, slowly, firmly. And then another rose beside her, then another, and then the entire back half of the room, advocates, survivors, students, mothers, were standing in unison. Applause thundered through the chamber. Some clapped with the force of relief. Others wept openly, hands shaking, their faces raw with vindication. These weren't political operatives. These were people who had felt invisible in rooms like this for too long. And now, for once, someone had spoken the truth for them, with them, as them. Meanwhile, the front rows, once so full of smug calm and conservative certainty, sat frozen. Faces flushed, eyes cast downward, some retreating into silence, others already whispering damage control into trembling phones. No one dared to interrupt. Even Abbott's closest aides remained seated, stunned. The image of their leader, pale, wordless, unraveling on national television, had eclipsed every soundbite and slogan they had prepared. They weren't witnessing a hearing anymore. They were witnessing the collapse of an illusion. The committee chair tried to intervene. His voice cracked as he called for order, gavel striking with desperate urgency. "Please, we must return to protocol." But the gavel sounded weak, like a toy hammer against the roar of something real. Order couldn't return because it had been built on a lie, and lies, once pierced, don't rebuild. The chamber no longer felt like a hearing room. It felt like a courtroom, a public trial, one where the jury wasn't 12 people in suits. It was the entire nation watching live, and justice finally had spoken. And as the gavel's hollow echoes faded into irrelevance, the storm inside the hearing room reached its final form. Not an explosion, but a quiet, clinical collapse of power. Greg Abbott, once the unmoved center of every room he entered, now stood hunched behind the witness desk, his hands fumbling with the scattered papers he had brought in as weapons, now rendered meaningless. He didn't speak, not a word. He didn't try to clarify or reframe. There was no final statement, no exit quote for the cameras. Just the mechanical, almost trembling effort of gathering documents that no longer mattered. His fingers shook as they slid folders into his briefcase, not with rage, but with the unspoken dread of a man who had just witnessed the undoing of his legacy in front of the very public he once commanded. The camera lenses stayed fixed on him, unblinking, documenting every second like a surgeon recording the end of a failed operation. His nameplate still sat on the table, staring back at him like an accusation carved in brass. From the far side of the room, two aides emerged, exchanging nervous glances before quietly stepping to his side. One whispered something inaudible, maybe confirmation that the side exit had been cleared, maybe a plea to move faster. Abbott nodded, barely, his eyes still locked on the table, as if ashamed to meet the gaze of the people he once claimed to lead. Then, without looking left or right, without so much as acknowledging the sea of stunned faces or the barrage of reporters awaiting a final soundbite, he turned. His movement was slow, stiff. The walk of a man who once entered with the presence of a monarch and now exited like a ghost. The side door, typically reserved for staff or security, opened with a soft click, and Abbott passed through it flanked by his aides, his back bowed not by age but by weight, the weight of truth, the weight of exposure, the weight of knowing that for all his power, for all his control, he couldn't defend himself when the facts stood tall, and the voices he tried to silence finally spoke. Cameras followed, some rushing, others fixed in place, their lenses capturing the precise angles that would flood news cycles before the hour was over. His retreat wasn't shouted over, it wasn't booed. That would have given him too much importance. No, his exit was met with something colder. Indifference. People had already turned to Crockett, already begun whispering her name, already started writing a new chapter in their minds, one where leadership looked and sounded different. But the image of Abbott, head down, shoulders hollowed, silence wrapping around him like chains, would become the moment everyone remembered. It was no longer about legislation. It was no longer about party lines. It was about a man walking away from his own narrative, exposed by documents he once hid and undone by women he once ignored. Behind him, the committee room remained lit, the mic still on, the truth still echoing. But Abbott was gone, not vanished, not erased, just irrelevant. And in American politics, that is the most devastating fate of all. Outside, news anchors would replay the footage, over and over, his hand trembling as he closed his briefcase, the camera flash catching the pallor on his face, the exact second his lips pressed together as he chose silence over explanation. Every detail would be magnified, frozen, shared across millions of screens, reduced to a symbol. A man who walked into a room convinced of his invincibility and walked out as a cautionary tale. It didn't matter that he said nothing. In fact, it mattered more. Because in the vacuum of that silence, a new voice had taken root. Jasmine Crockett's voice, clear, documented, unanswered. And as Abbott disappeared into the corridor beyond the chamber, that silence, the one he left behind, spoke louder than he ever could again. And while Abbott's retreat became the spectacle that filled every camera lens, the real center of gravity in the room never moved. Jasmine Crockett remained seated, still, composed, unshaken, as the gavel clattered pointlessly and aides scrambled to reestablish order. Her back straight, hands folded calmly before her, she did not glance at the door Abbott had disappeared through. She didn't need to. The point wasn't his exit. It was the truth left behind. In front of her, the pile of documents lay spread across the table like shattered glass. Each page a piece of evidence, each file a name, a face, a life nearly erased by law. The lighting had shifted in the room, ever so slightly, not from the overhead fixtures, but from something internal, something unspoken and seismic. Crockett's face bore no trace of triumph, no smile, no smirk, no raised fist. Just the poised stillness of a woman who had carried the unbearable weight of other people's suffering into this room and set it down, piece by piece, until everyone was forced to see it. There was a clarity in her eyes, an unwavering resolve that didn't ask for validation. She hadn't come here to win. She had come to witness, to document, to confront. And now, having done so, she sat not as a victor, but as a vessel for a truth long denied its rightful place in the record. Even as the crowd began to shift around her, reporters whispering, aides rushing, cameras repositioning, Crockett stayed in her chair, unbothered by the chaos. The world around her could move however it pleased. She would not, because her work in this moment wasn't about momentum, it was about memory. And what she had just done would not be forgotten. A producer in the press row gestured furiously to a cameraman, mouthing something urgent. But the camera was already where it needed to be, locked in on Crockett, unmoving, capturing the stillness that had followed the storm. This wasn't the shot they'd anticipated. It wasn't dramatic in the way politics is often staged. It was quiet, too quiet, but it was real, raw, resonant, the kind of image that burned deeper than headlines and lingered long after the talking points faded. She glanced down at the folder once more. Maria, Sarah, Jennifer. Their names weren't just on paper now, they were stitched into the air. The chamber, once a place where policy was debated like chess moves between elites, now held something sacred. A reckoning had happened here. A ledger had been rewritten. And though no sentence would undo the pain these women endured, something in Crockett's demeanor made it clear. She hadn't come to promise justice. She had come to deliver it. This was not about humiliating a governor. It was not about defeating an opponent. That would have been too small, too easy. What had just unfolded in that room was something far more dangerous to the old order, an act of moral reclamation. Crockett had taken a system that had for too long erased the humanity of its victims and forced it to look them in the face, one by one, with no shield, no distance, no abstraction, and she had done it without raising her voice, without theatrics, without leaving her chair. Behind her, the chamber's energy pulsed with transformation. People weren't clapping anymore. They were watching, thinking, recalculating the rules of engagement. It wasn't just Greg Abbott who had lost something in that room. It was the lie that strength comes from silence. That power is unaccountable. That truth is optional. Crockett had cracked that illusion wide open and left it bleeding under fluorescent light. And still, she didn't move. No aides rushed to her side. No PR team whispered in her ear. No one dared interrupt her stillness, because they could feel what she had done. And they knew, deeply, that it wasn't finished. That this wasn't an endpoint. It was a marker, a declaration that silence, complicity, and spin would no longer be enough. Not when truth had a name, not when pain had proof, not when justice had found its voice and refused to blink. So she sat, uncelebrated, unshaken, and unafraid. Not because she had won, but because, at last, the truth had been heard. And when the echo of silence finally gave way to the slow, rising tide of human sound, when the heavy air cracked open and something uncontainable slipped into the space left behind, Jasmine Crockett stood, not with swagger, not with spectacle, just purpose. The chamber hadn't moved yet. The lawmakers who remained were frozen in place, some stunned, others shaken, but all changed. She didn't look back at Greg Abbott's empty seat. There was no need. His absence said more than any rebuttal could. His retreat had been captured, broadcasted, immortalized. But she was still here, and she wasn't finished. She carefully closed the folder in front of her, not as a gesture of finality, but as a signal. The facts had been released. The truth had been spoken. The burden for now had been set down. As Crockett stepped away from the table, a hush washed across the room, like the final stillness after a violent storm. And then the clapping returned. This time it wasn't a burst of reaction, it was sustained, a deliberate, pulsing rhythm. It spread from the back rows forward, advocates, medical professionals, survivors, and ordinary citizens who had shown up expecting a hearing and instead witnessed a reckoning. Some stood, not out of coordination but compulsion. Others clapped with tears streaking down their cheeks, their hands trembling from the sheer emotional force of what they'd just experienced. They weren't cheering for a political win. They were bearing witness to a truth that had finally been given breath. Crockett didn't acknowledge the applause with a wave or a bow. That wasn't who she was, and this wasn't that kind of moment. She walked through it, silent, composed, unshaken, as the hands continued to strike together behind her, again and again, echoing off the marble, building into something that felt more spiritual than political, like a hymn in a courtroom. A eulogy turned into resurrection. She passed aides frozen with folders in hand. She passed officials who couldn't meet her eyes. She passed cameras still recording, still feeding into newsrooms where editors would scramble to find words bold enough to match the footage. She walked slowly, not out of hesitation, but to let the weight of what had been said and seen settle behind her like a wake. Her heels clicked in rhythm with the applause. She didn't adjust her pace. She didn't flinch when someone in the corner gasped her name in reverent disbelief. She had carried hundreds of voices into that chamber. Now those voices carried her out. As she entered the Capitol hallway, the light changed. It was brighter here, too bright, almost surgical, and for a moment, the cameras refracted. Reporters surged forward, mics extended, questions already forming on their lips. But no one dared to call her name. Something in her presence stopped them. Not fear, respect, gravity. She wasn't a headline anymore. She was the story. And then, through the crowd, past the reporters, between security and staff, a woman stepped forward. She wasn't young, but she carried herself with the urgency of someone who had waited a lifetime to speak. Her hair was pulled back. Her coat was wrinkled from being held in her lap for too long. And her voice, when she finally found it, was almost too soft to hear. "You didn't just save us," she said, her hand brushing Crockett's sleeve. "You made them listen." Crockett stopped, just for a second. Her eyes met the woman's, and in that unspoken exchange, something passed between them, heavier than language, older than politics. She gave a slight nod, then continued walking. The Capitol doors opened ahead, light poured in, natural and unapologetic. And outside the crowd had gathered, not organized, not planned, just people, men and women, young and old, some holding signs, others holding each other. They weren't chanting, they weren't waving flags. They were watching, waiting, hoping. And when she stepped into view, a sound rose. Not applause this time, but something deeper, a collective exhale, as if the nation itself had been holding its breath and had finally been given permission to release it. Some called her name. Some didn't say anything at all. One person simply whispered, "That's her," and the words spread down the line like a spark through dry grass. But she didn't raise her fist. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was the statement. She descended the steps slowly, her pace unbroken. And behind her, the Capitol loomed, not just a building, but a symbol of everything she had walked into and refused to be swallowed by. The truth had been spoken within those walls, and now she carried it beyond them. People turned their phones toward her, not to distract, but to preserve, because they knew what they were seeing wasn't just news. It was a moment, the kind of moment that redefines what's possible, that cracks the foundation of the untouchable, that reminds power it can still be humbled, by evidence, by courage, by someone who comes armed with only a folder and a voice unwilling to tremble. And in the minds of everyone watching, both in the crowd and across the nation, one question had begun to echo. It wasn't whispered in fear, it was spoken in awe. If the truth could bring down Greg Abbott, who would Jasmine Crockett expose next? And that question wasn't just curiosity, it was warning, because something had shifted in American politics that day, and there would be no going back. As the echoes of Jasmine Crockett's footsteps faded beyond the Capitol's marble arches, a profound stillness settled over the chamber. The air was thick with the weight of truth unveiled, leaving lawmakers and spectators alike in silent contemplation. This wasn't merely the aftermath of a political confrontation. It was the genesis of a movement demanding action. In the days that followed, the impact of Crockett's revelations reverberated across the nation. Communities previously disengaged from political discourse found themselves galvanized. Town halls filled with citizens seeking to understand the implications of the exposed truths. Social media platforms buzzed with discussions, debates, and calls for accountability. The veil had been lifted, and the public could no longer ignore these systemic issues laid bare. Grassroots organizations sprang into action, organizing rallies and informational sessions to educate the public on their rights and the importance of civic engagement. Voter registration drives saw unprecedented participation, especially among young adults in marginalized communities. The narrative had shifted from passive observation to active involvement, with citizens recognizing their power to affect change. Legislators, feeling the pressure from their constituents, began to reevaluate their positions. Some introduced bills aimed at addressing the injustices highlighted by Crockett, while others faced mounting criticism for their previous inaction. The political landscape was transforming, driven by a populace no longer willing to accept the status quo. Educational institutions incorporated discussions of the events into their curricula, fostering critical thinking and encouraging students to explore the complexities of governance and justice. Artistic expressions, murals, poems, songs emerged, capturing the spirit of the movement and ensuring that the message reached diverse audiences. Media outlets, recognizing the public's demand for transparency, dedicated extensive coverage to the unfolding developments. Investigative journalism flourished, uncovering further instances of systemic failures and prompting official inquiries. The role of the press as a watchdog was reinvigorated, holding those in power accountable. In this climate of awakening, civic education programs received increased funding and attention, aiming to equip citizens with the knowledge and tools necessary for meaningful participation in democracy. Workshops and seminars became commonplace, demystifying the legislative process and empowering individuals to advocate for their communities. The ripple effects extended beyond domestic borders, inspiring international dialogues on governance, accountability, and citizen empowerment. Activists from various countries cited the events as a catalyst for their own movements, demonstrating the universal resonance of the call for justice. As the movement gained momentum, it became clear that this was not a fleeting moment of outrage, but a sustained campaign for systemic reform. The collective action sparked by Crockett's courage underscored a fundamental truth. When informed and united, the people possessed the power to reshape their society. In the end, the chamber's silence gave way to a chorus of voices demanding change, illustrating that the true legacy of that pivotal moment was not confined to the walls of the Capitol, but lived on in the hearts and actions of the empowered citizenry. And as the last echo of Crockett's footsteps disappeared beyond the marble arches of the Texas Capitol, the chamber was left suspended, staring not just at the wreckage of a political giant, but at the raw, uncomfortable question he left behind. This hadn't been a hearing, it had been a mirror, and every person inside had just seen themselves in it, either as someone who looked away from injustice or someone who finally stared it down. The lesson didn't unfold in headlines or post-show analysis. It lived in the stillness that followed. It pulsed in the trembling hands of a young intern who'd never heard those statistics said aloud. It echoed in the rustle of papers a senator could no longer pretend not to read. It settled like ash on every aide, every lobbyist, every staffer who had spent years defending policy on paper but had never faced its consequences, spoken through a mother's breath, a teenager's nightmare, or a woman's near-death wait for permission to be saved. For decades, lawmakers had spoken in abstractions, but Jasmine Crockett had stripped the veil. She had brought the math of death into the room and dared anyone to subtract it. The humanitarian lesson was not subtle, it was searing, that justice is not always loud, but when it is finally spoken by someone brave enough, It has the power to make even power itself tremble. In every statistic she presented, there was a name. Behind every chart, a body. And for the first time, the debate was not theoretical. It was visceral. It bled. It cried. It begged to be heard. And Crockett had carried those voices not like trophies, but like gravestones, stacking them one by one on the table until the weight of the dead overwhelmed the politics of denial. Her power wasn't in her rank. It wasn't in her volume. It was in the unflinching way she let pain live in the room and refused to let anyone look away from it. That was the lesson, that the truth, when wielded with clarity, backed by proof, and delivered without apology, is not just inconvenient, it's devastating. And in the hands of someone who doesn't seek applause, it can flatten institutions built on silence. But there was another lesson buried deeper. It was in the way Crockett never smiled, in how she never paused for the cameras, in the haunting restraint of a woman who knew this wasn't about political sport. It was about returning dignity to those who never got a seat at the table. She didn't come to destroy Abbott. She came to break the system that let Abbott thrive while women bled. She came not to win, but to warn. And that warning rang louder than any insult or takedown ever could. Because there is something revolutionary about a person who refuses to be reduced to anger or grief, who carries the full weight of injustice, but never lets it crush her. Crockett wasn't a firebrand. She was a reckoning, controlled, precise, and permanent. The moral was painful in its simplicity. Laws are written by people, but they live or die inside the bodies of those who never voted for them. That is why policy matters. That is why truth must be spoken. That is why silence is not neutral. It's lethal. And those who benefit from that silence are never the ones forced to bear its consequences. Greg Abbott signed a bill. But Maria held her baby as it died. Sarah fled her own home to survive. Jennifer nearly lost her life waiting for permission. Abbott stood behind a podium. They bled on hospital floors. And for too long, that distance had gone unchecked, until Crockett collapsed it in real time, forcing a nation to ask itself how many more would suffer before someone said, enough. The final humanitarian lesson wasn't just about abortion. It was about proximity. It was about whether the powerful are willing to get close enough to hear the gas, see the blood, hold the trembling hands of those who scream in silence, while policies are printed on clean white paper. It was about whether anyone would have the courage to bring those hands into the hearing room and say, she matters, even if she's poor, even if she's black, even if she can't donate to your campaign. And Jasmine Crockett did that, without yelling, without cruelty, without showmanship. She just told the truth and trusted that it would burn hot enough to melt even the coldest indifference. She knew the stakes. She knew that rooms like these were designed to intimidate, to control, to silence. But she also knew that when the silence is built on injustice, breaking it becomes a moral obligation. She didn't come to play politics. She came to rescue integrity. And in doing so, she left everyone else in the room with a choice: to return to comfort or to live differently because they could no longer pretend not to know. That is the cruel beauty of truth. Once heard, it cannot be unheard. Once seen, it cannot be unseen. And when it's delivered by someone who doesn't crave power, but purpose, it becomes contagious. That's the part no one anticipated. Not Abbott, not the aides, not the senators who'd rolled their eyes when they saw her name on the roster. They expected a firework. What they got was a fault line. She didn't just break a narrative, she cracked the floor beneath it. And through that crack, the faces of the forgotten rose. The young girl on a bus, hiding her fear behind a duffel bag. The mother holding her child's death certificate instead of a birth one. The woman with Abbott's last name, sitting in silence with tubes in her arms, waiting for someone to decide if her pain was legal enough to relieve. Those were the real witnesses. And Crockett had brought them all to the stand without ever calling a single one. In the end, the lesson wasn't about who won or lost. It was about who finally got to be seen. The American experiment has always been torn between ideal and reality. But on that day in that room, Jasmine Crockett forced the gap between them to close, if only for an hour. And in doing so, she proved something that every generation must learn again. That courage is not loud, it is steady. That power is not might, it is truth. And that justice is not a soundbite. It is the quiet, unwavering choice to stand when others stay seated, to speak when silence would be safer, and to name what no one else dares to admit. It is not easy. It is not pretty. But it is the only thing that has ever moved the world forward. And in that moment, against a governor, a law, a chamber designed to resist her, Jasmine Crockett moved it. As the echoes of Jasmine Crockett's footsteps faded beyond the Capitol's marble arches, a profound stillness settled over the chamber. The air was thick with the weight of truth unveiled, leaving lawmakers and spectators alike in silent contemplation. This wasn't merely the aftermath of a political confrontation, it was the genesis of a movement demanding action. In the days that followed, the impact of Crockett's revelations reverberated across the nation. Communities previously disengaged from political discourse found themselves galvanized. Town halls filled with citizens seeking to understand the implications of the exposed truths. Social media platforms buzzed with discussions, debates, and calls for accountability. The veil had been lifted, and the public could no longer ignore the systemic issues laid bare. Grassroots organizations sprang into action, organizing rallies and informational sessions to educate the public on their rights and the importance of civic engagement. Voter registration drives saw unprecedented participation, especially among young adults in marginalized communities. The narrative had shifted from passive observation to active involvement, with citizens recognizing their power to affect change. Legislators, feeling the pressure from their constituents, began to reevaluate their positions. Some introduced bills aimed at addressing the injustices highlighted by Crockett, while others faced mounting criticism for their previous inaction. The political landscape was transforming, driven by a populace no longer willing to accept the status quo. Educational institutions incorporated discussions of the events into their curricula, fostering critical thinking and encouraging students to explore the complexities of governance and justice. Artistic expressions, murals, poems, songs emerged, capturing the spirit of the movement and ensuring that the message reached diverse audiences. Media outlets, recognizing the public's demand for transparency, dedicated extensive coverage to the unfolding developments. Investigative journalism flourished, uncovering further instances of systemic failures and prompting official inquiries. The role of the press as a watchdog was reinvigorated, holding those in power accountable. In this climate of awakening, civic education programs received increased funding and attention, aiming to equip citizens with the knowledge and tools necessary for meaningful participation in democracy. Workshops and seminars became commonplace, demystifying the legislative process and empowering individuals to advocate for their communities. The ripple effects extended beyond domestic borders, inspiring international dialogues on governance, accountability, and citizen empowerment. Activists from various countries cited the events as a catalyst for their own movements, demonstrating the universal resonance of the call for justice. As the movement gained momentum, it became clear that this was not a fleeting moment of outrage, but a sustained campaign for systemic reform. The collective action sparked by Crockett's courage underscored a fundamental truth. When informed and united, the people possess the power to reshape their society. In the end, the chamber's silence gave way to a chorus of voices demanding change, illustrating that the true legacy of that pivotal moment was not confined to the walls of the Capitol, but lived on in the hearts and actions of the empowered citizenry. In the wake of Jasmine Crockett's powerful confrontation with Governor Greg Abbott over Texas's restrictive abortion laws, the political landscape of the state underwent a seismic shift. The hearing, which had initially been anticipated as a routine legislative session, transformed into a pivotal moment that galvanized public opinion and spurred a wave of activism across the nation. The immediate aftermath saw a surge in grassroots mobilization. Organizations advocating for reproductive rights experienced an influx of volunteers and donations, enabling them to expand their outreach and support services. Community forums and town hall meetings were organized to educate citizens about the implications of the abortion laws and to strategize on effective means of advocacy. Social media platforms buzzed with discussions, hashtags trending as people shared personal stories and rallied support for change. Legislators, both within Texas and beyond, felt the pressure of the public's response. Some began to reconsider their stances, acknowledging the need for clearer guidelines and exceptions within the abortion laws to protect women's health. Bills were proposed to address the ambiguities and to ensure that medical professionals could provide necessary care without fear of legal repercussions. The political discourse shifted, with reproductive rights taking center stage in legislative agendas. Media coverage intensified, with national and international outlets highlighting the developments in Texas. Investigative reports delved into the real-life consequences of the abortion laws, bringing to light stories of women who faced dire health risks due to delayed or denied medical care. These narratives humanize the issue, fostering empathy and a deeper understanding among the public. Educational institutions incorporated discussions about reproductive rights and civic engagement into their curricula, encouraging students to explore the complexities of the issue and to participate in the democratic process. Workshops and seminars were held to empower individuals with the knowledge and tools needed to advocate for change effectively. The momentum extended beyond Texas, inspiring similar movements in other states grappling with restrictive abortion laws. Activists and organizations collaborated across state lines, sharing strategies and resources to amplify their impact. The collective action underscored the power of unified voices in challenging and reshaping policies that affect fundamental rights. As the movement gained traction, it became evident that the issue transcended political affiliations, touching on core values of autonomy, health, and justice. Public opinion polls reflected a growing consensus on the need for compassionate and sensible approaches to reproductive health care. This shift in perspective prompted some policymakers to adopt more nuanced positions, seeking to balance moral considerations with the practical realities faced by women and healthcare providers. In the months that followed, tangible changes began to materialize. Legal challenges to the restrictive abortion laws were mounted, with courts scrutinizing the constitutionality and human impact of the legislation. Some provisions were overturned or amended, providing relief to those affected and setting precedents for future cases. Healthcare facilities reported increased confidence among medical professionals in administering necessary care without legal hindrance. The cultural landscape also evolved, with art, literature, and media reflecting the ongoing discourse around reproductive rights. Films, documentaries, and books explored the personal and societal dimensions of the issue, fostering dialogue and awareness. Public figures and influencers used their platforms to advocate for change, reaching diverse audiences and galvanizing support. Jasmine Crockett's role in catalyzing this movement was widely recognized and celebrated. Her unwavering commitment to justice and her ability to articulate the concerns of marginalized communities resonated with many. She became a symbol of effective leadership and the impact of courageous advocacy within the political arena. The ripple effects of her actions demonstrated the profound influence that individuals can have in shaping public policy and discourse. Her example inspired a new generation of activists and leaders to engage with the political process, emphasizing the importance of representation and accountability. As the movement continued to evolve, it underscored the necessity of ongoing vigilance and participation in democratic processes. The strides made in the aftermath of the hearing served as a testament to the power of collective action and the enduring pursuit of equity and justice within society.